sedated and muscle relaxed, and then their SVO2 is going down without you changing your delivery, think about what else would be contributing to increased oxygen demand. So seizures is one. Sepsis, obviously we can have increased oxygen consumption. And then hyperthermia can cause increased oxygen consumption. And then you can have measurement artifacts as well. Depends on, like, if you don't have if you're not measuring from the right place, you're not getting the accurate information. So other things that we look at besides SVO2 are, we can look at plasma lactate, we can look at tissue saturations, and then we look at all the other perfusion, urine output, and then how about oxygenation on VV ECMO? So before we go to VV, are there any other questions about VA? Because I think the important thing on VA, we really do try to focus on utilizing the SVO2 as much as possible and trying not to focus as much on PaO2 to really try, since we have it, to really try to focus on, are we meeting the patient's demands? And that's something that we'll talk about a lot when we're rounding on a patient, is what are our mixed venous sets? Other questions that people have about troubleshooting? Let me talk about VV, because VV, the problem with VV is it's just a little bit more challenging to try to actually figure out if you're meeting their demands. All right, so if you look at, Laura, remind me, do we talk specifically about VV tomorrow too?
Mm-hmm.
Is it
There's
VV?
a separate NV versus VV.
Yeah. So this will be an introduction, but I think that the biggest thing to remember is on VV, you're always going to have a component of recirculation, right? So not all, and how well you're delivering oxygen to the tissues is totally going to depend on how much you're recirculating. So for example, you can have having a really high mixed venous saturation is not necessarily a good thing, because it just may mean that you're recirculating a lot of blood, so your mixed venous sat is very good. But your patient arterial set is not so good. And so it's important to think about what are all the determinants of recirculation. So what are the things that contribute to how much recirculation have? Probably the biggest one is cannula position and orientation, and this is why when we put kids on VV, one of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about and dealing with immediately post going on is trying to make sure that we have ideal cannula, or the most ideal cannula position possible, and that the cannula is oriented in the right direction to minimize recirculation. It's one of the reasons that VV ECMO in many ways is harder than VA ECMO, is there's so much manipulation to try to minimize recirculation, where VA is easier, but you don't have to ligate the crotch artery in VV. So cannula position, orientation, and then the circuit pump flow rate. Because if you think about it, if you flow too fast, you can actually recirculate more. And so you're trying to find sort of the sweet spot where you're minimizing recirculation, but you're not contributing to more recirculation. I'll show you a picture. And then obviously your cardiac output, because you're completely dependent on native cardiac output, and your right atrial volume. So that makes a huge, so the smaller your right atrium volume, the more recirculation you're gonna have. And so that's where, if you have a very leaky patient, for example, or a septic patient, it's gonna be really difficult to manage them on VV. And so this just looks like so here you can see as your, so as you go up and up on your pump flow, your effective flow peaks here at about 400 cc's per minute in this particular example, and then starts to go down as you go up on your flow. And you have more and more recirculation. And we'll talk a lot more about that tomorrow. So when you think about oxygen transfer then across the oxygenator on VV, You're still looking at the amount of oxygen transferred across it as determined by the saturation of the blood entering the oxygenator, the oxygenator sweep FiO2, your hemoglobin, and your bypass flow rate. The biggest difference on VV is gonna be that saturation of blood entering the oxygenator. And your venous return line stats are really gonna be determined by both your mixed venous saturation and your recirculation. And that's one of the reasons that trends in your mixed venous can be helpful on VV, but the total number is not that helpful. Because the total number could look really high and you could be in a lot of trouble. So on VV, you'll see us spend much less time talking about mixed venous stats and more time focusing on the patient stats and the patient PaO2. And those are gonna be determined by what your flow is, how much recirculation you have, what your oxygen content is, your native cardiac output, because you're not providing any cardiac output, your mixed venous saturation, and then any addition of oxygen into the blood by the lungs. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's important too. So on VV, ECMO, for example, if your circuit venous saturations are increasing, so your SpO2 is increasing, it's either a good sign or a bad sign. So it either means you have a higher mixed venous sat, or it means you have more recirculation, one or the other. And then same thing, if your circuit venous saturations are decreasing, either you have less recirculation or you have a lower mixed venous sat. So that's where you need to look at all your other markers. So what's my cardiac output? What's my patient PaO2 and sat? You know, what's my lactate? What's my urine output? You can't just use your mixed venous sat. So if that's the case, then how do we improve oxygenation on VV ECMO? So there's a few different things you can do. So one, obviously you attempt to decrease your recirculation. That's easier said than done. So you want to make sure you're optimizing your cannula position. You want to make sure your right atrium volume is as plump as you can make it. And then you can attempt to compensate by running at higher bypass flows. But remember, that's where we'll actually turn up our bypass flows to try to optimize. And then at some point, you'll see your oxygen delivery go down, and then you back up. You're going to you can maintain a higher hemoglobin. So if you have marginal oxygen delivery on VV, this is where we might shoot for a higher hemoglobin. And then you can use a higher sweep FiO2. So we'll often use a higher, so instead of an FiO2 of 30%, for example, you might use an FiO2 of 60%. You can augment your venous drainage, so if you're not getting enough, generally this is not the case in our neonates, but in the older kids, you can use more than one venous drainage limb to improve your venous drainage. And then the other thing is that we tend to tolerate lower saturations in PaO2 as long as you have other evidence of adequate oxygen delivery. So as long as your lactate's good, your urine output's good, your patient, your perfusion is good, we actually will tolerate, typically we'll shoot for sats of above 85 on VV and a PaO2 anywhere from 50 to 60. You can support your cardiac output, and then the other thing that often you'll see us do is to augment with gas exchange of the lungs. And this is where you get, if you're having to, for example, if you're having to turn up your, maintain your FiO2 at 100% and not able to wean your pressures on VV, so essentially you're using your lungs and you're also adding an ECMO circuit, probably you're not doing what the whole point of putting them on VV ECMO is to try to minimize barotrauma, right, and minimize oxygen exposure. If you're using both the ventilator at max capacity and the ECMO circuit, that's one of the things we'll start to think about. Well, maybe this is a patient who actually needs VA. And then you can attempt to decrease oxygen consumption. So we will sometimes tend to use a little bit more sedation and think about muscle relaxation if you have a patient that you're just barely meeting their demands and you want to try to minimize their consumption. And then lastly, you can convert to VA, which we'll talk about more tomorrow. But it's much trickier. It's much more fine-tuning than you see on VA, where it's more straightforward. And then lastly, see, I took out those complicated ones and vastly sped it up. So any other questions about oxygenation? We'll talk more about oxygenation on VV tomorrow because it's complex. It's definitely not straightforward. Any other questions?
Bless you.
That makes
Yeah.
sense.
All right, so let's move to CO2 exchange. How do you what's the answer? How do you modulate CO2 exchange in ECMO?
Sweet flow.
Sweet.
Yeah. So your CO2 exchange is gonna be dependent on your gas diffusion pressure gradient, your gas flow rate, and your membrane surface area, but it's completely independent of your blood flow rate. So the bottom line, to increase your CO2 removal, decrease your post-membrane CO2, and decrease your patient CO2, you need to increase your gas sweep rate. And then the other thing is you can decrease the amount of CO2 in the sweep gas if you're using a blended gas, but we don't use blended gases here. Don't worry about that. And just to keep in mind your rate of flow, we don't ever go near that in the small one. And that's part of the reason we use our weight cutoff substantially below the rate of flow, so that you don't need to worry so much about that. So your CO2 is gonna be dependent on your sweep gas flow. Increasing your flow rate is gonna decrease your CO2. That is all I have to say about CO2 exchange. Any questions about that part? In general, it's not so much an issue of dealing with, at least for us, with hypercarbia as it is dealing with hypocarbia. Yeah,
Question about oxygenation?
yeah.
Is there a flow rate, like a high flow rate at which, like if you turn up so high that you're actually gonna impede oxygenation because your time in contact with the gas is going to
You don't impede it, but you hit the limit of what the oxygenator can actually adapt to or continue building on. So that's where, when we were talking about the flow rates of the oxygenator, so the blue one, the pediatric, you can go up to 2.8 liters of blood flow, and you presume that you're gonna have improving oxygenation for that, but you can't handle a capacity higher than that. So it's not that it impedes, you just don't get any more benefit from it.
The more practical issue is not being able to achieve flows high enough. So particularly in the small kids, if you don't have enough venous return to support running at a flow, for example, we often can't run at a flow higher than 120 to 150 per kilo in our smallest kids. And so it's, once you're there, then you can't go up in the flow anymore. So that's where you then get into, can I manipulate my hemoglobin? Can I manipulate my FiO2? What else can I do to try to support? Or can I improve, is there anything else I can do to improve cardiac output? But yeah, it's generally more, it's not so much can you, the oxygenator itself as it is how much flow you get. And the other thing to remember is the higher you flow, the more RPMs you're using, the more your risk for hemolysis too. So there's a cost for that.
The rate limiting feature is much more around the cannula size and around your patient's actual physiology in terms of their volume status and their SVR than it has to do with anything in the middle of the circuit.
So we'll come
Actually, I
back to
take that back. The one place we do see a limit is in our really big pediatric patients. Because here, we tend to only put in one oxygenator in line, which that has a rate of flow of just above 5 liters. And when you're flowing 5 liters, you're pretty much maxing out the amount that you can get from it. And so sometimes in adult patients or very large pediatric patients, institutions will put more than one oxygenator in line in order to overcome that. Traditionally, I don't know that we've ever done that here, or if we did, it was a million years ago. That's the only time I've seen us hit capacitance.
I know in the adult program at Michigan, it was not uncommon for them to use more than one oxygenator in line, particularly in the very, very large adults.
Yes.
Which tends to be a frequent occurrence in the
See,
adult
that's the one
ICUs.
time that I remember
Yeah.
seeing an oxygenator fail for gas exchange was he was something like 80 kilo kid up in the pediatric ICU that we were flowing 5 liters per minute, so we were already at the upper end of what the oxygenator could do for us. And so then it eventually failed on gas exchange because there wasn't as much redundancy within it, is the way I think about it.
So all of this, I think, will become much more practical as we talk more about the actual management of kids on VA and VD, and it'll be, now it seems kind of esoteric, but it'll become much more you'll be able to put it into practice more once we sort of move further along. But it
Yeah.
is, this is the stuff that we really talk about, so when you're rounding on your patient, this is where you really need to think about, so you're not just thinking about your patient gases, you're thinking about your memory functions, your pre and post membrane gases, and then you're really thinking about your delivery. And that's where you're gonna use your SVO2 as well as your lactation and all the other things. It's much more, we think about oxygen delivery and oxygen demand much more than we do in our everyday jobs, which you probably should think about more about now.
No, I think it's more complex once you're in ECMO because you're integrating more things in your thought process. And I do think it's the challenge with teaching this class is that there are certain pieces of what you were talking about, like, oh, until they hear the surgical
Yeah.
cannulation talk, this isn't gonna make any sense. But then it gets heady if you start lumping all of this stuff together. So part of what people have talked about in the past has been that there's redundancy in this course, and so one of the things that I'll challenge you on when you're filling out your evaluation forms is to think about whether it's truly redundant and it didn't make sense to have it again, or whether some of the redundancy we've done intentionally, one, to either layer and reinforce concepts, or two, because we realize that, for example, if you hear gas exchange this morning and then I'll do surgical cannulation this afternoon and we'll talk about VA versus VB and go back and visit some of this stuff again, does it make sense in a different way hearing it in the afternoon, but you still had to have the foundational piece so that then when we were looking at cannulation and talking about cannulas, if you started to ask the right questions. You were super fast this time. Questions, or are you guys ready for a lunch break? Alright, so take your lunch break. I think the only speakers this afternoon are Kim and I, so do you guys want to just take until around 12:30 and we'll start up a little? Oh, no, you have the faculty that come.
Yeah.
There's a fellow
Yeah.
lecture from 12 to 1, it's like all fellows,
Oh,
let's see, all
Alright, well, I guess we're meeting at
All fellows, but-
I was trying to get you guys out of here.
It's not for the neonatal fellow.
I think
I,
You're not heard of.
there's
Yeah.
really